Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the International Marketing Manager for E.J. Krause & Associates, Pat Tessler.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 8th Annual M-Enabling Summit. It's a pleasure to see you all here this morning. We've got a terrific lineup of speakers, informative sessions, and some wonderful, wonderful networking opportunities we hope you'll take advantage of, and we hope you'll have a good time. We're going to start off this morning with our first round of lightning talks, which is hosted by Debra Rue. Debra Rue is the CEO of Rue Global Impact. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Debra. She's a very impressive person. She is the Global Disability Inclusion Strategist, market influencer, internationally recognized keynote speaker, published author, branding expert, successful entrepreneur, and an exceptional mother. Debra was called to action when she was told that her daughter Sarah, who was born with Down syndrome, would never walk or talk. Refusing to accept that prognosis, she instead dedicated her life to creating a path to empowerment and success for her daughter and all those with disabilities. She consults Fortune 100 companies and nations, including Kenya, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and China. Debra and her daughter Sarah are now internationally renowned global keynote speakers, traveling the world, advocating for governments and corporations on behalf of people with disabilities. And I give you Debra Rue.
I'm missing a speaker. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of M-Enabling. Isn't it amazing? So I love this conference. I love the energy and that people are coming from all over the world, so it's very exciting. So today, we're trying something new. We're going to do lightning rounds, and we're going to talk about 4 different topics, and we're going to have a main presenter, and then they're going to have 2 respondents. And at the end, if we have time, which I hope we will, we're going to open it up to the audience. And at the time, what we'll do, I'm going to scoot over, just cut out some of that noise. But what we'll do is, if we have time for questions, we'll want you to keep the question very tight, under 10 seconds, and for you to tell us which panel member you want to ask the question of. So this is going to be fun and exciting, and we're going to talk about some really cool topics. I do want to say if Paul Schroeder happens to be in the audience, he should be up here walking up on stage. So if not, we're going to keep going because this is going to be exciting. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about 4 very important topics: 5G, network performance and users' experience. We're going to talk about the key performance indicators for accessibility. Digital accessibility, should legislation evolve. Smart cities for all. So it's going to be really fast-paced, and it's the first time, and we want your comments. We want to know what we can do to improve it, how we can make it more fun, what topics you want, and we really want to have fun with this. So I'm going to welcome up my first panelist. And Chip Strange is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at UCLA, where he leads the Global Alliance Development, Government, and Regulatory Affairs, along with UCLA's engagement with industry and public policy organizations. You can sit right here, Chip. He joined UCLA in June 2018 after its acquisition of Moasic, where he had been responsible for corporate strategy, marketing, product management, software engineering functions, and prior to working there, he worked for Altel Communications and Verizon Wireless. One of our respondents today is Mary Boomer. A lot of you will know Mary. She's been around a long time. She's considered a leader all over the world. She is the principal of MB Consulting, and she's an experienced consulting partner for creating strategic partnerships with wireless service providers, manufacturers, and organizations that serve and benefit persons with disabilities. And she graduated from the University of Notre Dame Law School. And she lived in Washington for years, but she now lives in Eugene, Oregon. So welcome. And once again, Paul Schroeder will maybe join us as well. So we're gonna go ahead and start, but this is gonna be fun, and we really want y'all to engage with us. So we're gonna start. We're gonna get the information out, and we're gonna spend enough. We're gonna do a very quick, fun time. So, Chip, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all. This is really exciting for me personally because this is a community that I've I've not fully engaged in, and I have to say that the opportunity to listen and learn is something that I've been looking forward to since I was invited. For those of you who are not aware, Ookla is a Seattle, Washington-based company with about 110 employees worldwide. You would probably more readily know us by our marketing presence, which is Speed Test. So if any of you have ever been interested in testing your internet performance, testing the quality of your mobile network, chances are you've gone to speedtest.net, you've downloaded an array of our different applications. However, Speed Test is much more than just a website to test internet performance and a series of apps. We're an entire ecosystem whereby we are embedded inside of a whole suite of different types of products that you may or may not have interacted with. We have embedded software inside of routers, so we are happy to partner with some of the largest and most successful router manufacturers in the world, so that if you are interested in enough to go into your advanced settings of your router and really manage your network, you could perform a speed test within the router itself. We're also inside of the test and measurement equipment that many of your service providers are using as part of the installation or troubleshooting process. But ultimately, our primary focus is on consumers. We were founded in 2006 in an attempt to make sure that consumers had the information that they needed to best manage their internet connections and best manage their relationships with the operators providing those services. Over the years, like all companies, we've grown. We now have a very robust data set that we provide out to operators, MVNOs, regulators, so that we can all help deliver a better internet. That's ultimately our goal. As we think about 5G, I think there are a couple of things to mention. Obviously, there's a lot of buzz, as with any new wireless technology, as there should be. This is genuinely a generational shift. The transition from 4G to 5G is a significant one. And what we will have and what the opportunities are for sort of three primary components, right? You're going to have gigabit mobile internet service, which is a huge step forward. You will have the ability to have machines talking to each other faster and more and closer to actual consumers. And of course, you'll have what we hope to be is ultra reliable, low latency service, which is, I think, another key element of this. The flip side is I think we should all temper our expectations to a degree about what and when 5G will be available on a particular network, in a particular nation, or at the local level. One of the differences between 4G and 5G is that 5G is much broader in scope, which means the possibilities are much greater. However, it's not quite as tight a market, so that the enablement of those technologies and the availability of these services, I think, will be slower because it's going to be a bit more of a bifurcated market. And this is a product of an array of different reasons. Obviously, the nation that the networks are deployed in and what their spectrum policies are and the relative maturation of those operators is certainly one component. But even within the United States, you'll have differences between the spectrum that these networks are deployed over and then ultimately what types of services can be delivered across or over the spectrum that the operator owns. So I think I would recommend patience as the market sorts itself out, but it is genuinely an exciting time as we think about the possibilities associated with 5G and the use cases therein.
I think, yeah.
Should it work? Oh, okay,
Yes.
excuse me. So Paul Schrader is just coming up, so I'll go first, and then he can respond. I agree with Chip very much that we're kind of in the hurry up and wait stage. 5G is going to begin to be deployed this year. Minneapolis, Sacramento, there's a number of cities that will start having deployment of 5G. But we're not going to really see 5G where most of us in this room, unless we're working in the high-tech areas, will know what it is and use it until 21, 22, 23. I mean, it will then 53%, 55% of the markets will start having it. And all the multiple carriers will have it. So it's a bit frustrating to talk about something that you can't see and feel immediately, but that's just the way it is. I think it's more than a generational change. I think it's like before triplets and after triplets. You know, I mean, the world changes. It's just different. Because we're going to have latency that is 5 times less than it is now. It's going to go to nearly zero to download your YouTube whatever, or your virtual reality applications. The speed is 100 times faster, and that means that if you're a young millennial and you're going to have teen kids around 2025 running around your house, they're going to have absolutely no patience about anything because the internet will do everything so fast. So they won't know why you talk so slowly, or why it takes so long for the pizza delivery person to come. And maybe it will take less time because of 5G, but still, it's going to be such a shift. Like those of us who remember when we didn't have cellular and now we have 4G. It's also good. I've been a skeptic about autonomous vehicles, and I know this room is filled with people who are waiting anxiously for autonomous vehicles. I had a new insight into it when I was doing some reading for this morning. 4G gives a vehicle basically 4.5 feet improvement on making a stop to prevent an accident. 5G will give 1 inch. So that's like 55 inches versus 1 inch. That's like saves a lot of lives at pedestrian crossings, and automobile accidents and different kinds of things. So that's the potential of 5G, and that made an impact on me. I thought, oh, that's a case I understand. And I think it's also going to make a big deal in what mobile operators offer. Their data capabilities are going to be so huge. You may actually get unlimited data, like you get unlimited calling for free, or when no roaming fees were a big deal back in the 3G day. So that's just some of what we're likely to see and how it will impact us. And Paul has a technology. He's with a company that really will benefit from 5G. So take it over, Paul.
And Paul, before you start, this is Debra, and I'm just going to do your bio. So Paul is the Vice President of Public Policy and Strategic Initiatives for ARA, and they provide people who are blind or low vision with convenient and on-demand mobile access to visual information. He's based in Washington, D.C., and he leads the policy engagement related to state, federal programs and supports ARIA's business development and manages relationships with key disability and consumer organizations. And he was formerly with the American Foundation for the Blind. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks so much, Debra, and I apologize for messing up your schedule this morning. I'm very glad to be here as part of this 5G conversation. So as Mary indicated and as Debra graciously said about IRA and our access to visual information, connectivity is key, and low latency connectivity is essential. We do provide on-demand access using cell network connectivity. So a blind person uses their smartphone, the camera on their smartphone, to send video upstream to a sighted agent who are trained and paid by IRA. They work remotely. They work typically from their home. They get the video stream, and they are able to provide assistance with navigation, reading, description, possibly making sure someone finds the ballroom fast enough in the Renaissance Hotel to be at the session. So whatever it might be. And as you can imagine, especially when we're talking about navigation, a low latency, that is to say very quick response rate, virtually instantaneous video is absolutely essential. And honestly, if the biggest Achilles heel for a company like IRA, and surely others around this room, is cell connectivity, where you don't have it you're in deep trouble. So you don't have access to the cat video or Baby Shark when you need it most. And so in our case, you don't have access to the solution for on-demand access to visual information. And there are places where you need it very much, large, complex indoor spaces, for example, that often don't have good cell connectivity, rural spaces. So we're very excited for the advent. 5G can't come fast enough, right, to make sure that we've got connectivity in lots of locations like we do today, but certainly moving into some of these other areas where we do struggle to have cell connectivity. The thing that I don't pretend to know a lot about this area, other than I know we need it, but I do know that there is not an insubstantial infrastructure investment that still needs to take place, right? Yes, lots of little cells in lots of places, and much easier to get those cells in places, but they still have to be connected on a pretty good pipe, as it were, in order to move the data quickly to and from. And one of the points that we make for a service like IRA is that we're streaming video in from the edge, as opposed to people who are demanding lots of content coming out to them on their network. And so in our case, we want to make sure that, and I think for others too, and certainly the autonomous vehicle is another example of that, there's got to be really good two-way high bandwidth capability, low latency capability. And so all of those things mean that 5G offers great opportunities. I do worry, as we all do, about rural spaces. Often connectivity has come slowest to those areas, and I know a lot of places where people say, when we talk about 5G, I would love to just have 4G. Frankly, I'd love to have a dependable cell connection of any kind in my part of the country. And so it is the area where investment tends to lag frequently, and I suspect, would not be at all surprised to suspect that that's going to be the case with 5G as well. And so what that does is leave those communities further behind in all the great things that we're able to do with networks. And in the case of a company like ours, IRA's service, it means that blind people living in those areas also lack the kind of connectivity and support that a service like ours can provide. So very excited. I am sorry that I missed a bit of Chip's comments, although I certainly am aware of this issue and what was going to be talked about. But glad that we have this lightning opportunity. I'm going to surrender the time, and I don't know where we go from here, Debra, but thanks for letting me be part of the panel.
Yes. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And you all brought up some really good points about, the value that 5G is going to provide to society. But as Paul was just mentioning, and Chip, you mentioned the speed test, I live in the wilds of Virginia, outside Richmond, Virginia, and we barely have 3G. And I have Verizon Wireless, which I love as a provider, and my cell phone barely works. And so I've had to spend a whole bunch of money to have a situation happen so that we can actually, have internet access. So I'm curious, once again, I'd love to have, good 3G. And I'm just right outside Richmond, so I'm in a very populated area. But how, what does this mean to assistive technology? And, how do we make sure that people with disabilities continue to benefit from what we're doing with these technologies, the 3G, 4G, the 5G, and make sure that we're all included and making sure that technology is available to all of us? So, Mary, you want to start, and then Chip?
Yeah, I'll start the discussion. One of the things about 5G, unlike the other generations of wireless cellular, is that it uses multiple bandwidths. It uses high band, mid band, and low band. Mid band and low band are pretty available in rural areas, and so some functions will be will be more available than other functions. And that's just going to take time to work out the edges. One of the things, I live not in a rural area, but the state of Oregon is only 3 million people, so it is a rural state in many places. But there is a real resistance to anything techie in many communities and many populations of Oregon. So one of the biggest things that all of you can do is support your utilities, your phone companies in putting up 5G nodes on utility poles, the pizza box size nodes that will be around. And that will help you get 5G eventually. Without it, the community won't have it. So.
And just to add on, I think certainly 5G as a particular set of technologies is an important note, but there's a whole nother set of infrastructure that's required, as Paul pointed out. You're talking about having to have power and fiber to every one of these groups of antennas, and these antennas are quite small. So the number of antennas that will be delivering radio frequencies are going to be growing astronomically. And it's putting a lot of pressure on policymakers, both at the local level and at state and federal levels, to sort of manage this. And I have to commend the FCC for trying to work through this while respecting the autonomy of state and local communities, trying to have federal policies that support widespread adoption of this type of technology. With respect to the rural gaps, right, this is a real problem. Everyone knows it. It is a massive funding effort that will be necessary. The market dictates where private companies deploy their capital and try to provide a return on their investors and for their investors. And where there's a difference there is where federal, state, and local governments can come in to try to fill in. And there is an effort, and always an effort via universal service and other programs to try to fill in that. But I'm not going to sit here and say that there is a solution in the immediate term for 5G or 4G for that matter. Right. Everywhere.
Right. Paul, do you want to comment on it? We have 3 minutes, and I know the next panel is making their way up.
Go ahead to your next topic if you want.
No, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, no, I don't have anything to add on your question.
Cool. All right, cool. So we do have 3 more minutes. So how does it work with some of the activities that are happening to make sure that we have people-centered internet and the net neutrality and some of that? Because I know in a lot of conversations I have, these two subjects seem to come up together.
I'll jump in for a little bit of this. So a year ago, there was a hearing on data prioritization, which was sort of an attempt to look at net neutrality from I guess, a different perspective. And we were invited to testify, and I was a little uncomfortable, and I said to the group organizing the House hearing that, look, we don't have a statement on net neutrality, and nor would we make one because it's really a little bit outside of IRA's area. But they said, no, but you do have a really important data prioritization story to tell. And it's a tricky area, right, for a company like ours that needs to deliver, as I said, the high bandwidth, low latency connection, to be able to move video quickly from the edge to one of our agents, and then who can then respond, of course, with audio. So it's video upstream, audio backstream. And we talked about, and I made the point that I don't know what the right answer to that is, but I do know that for various kinds of disability services that really need this kind of connectivity, there absolutely has to be an assurance that the data moves through. 5G offers a lot of bandwidth opportunity to be able to make that happen as compared to today's cell network. But we all know the stories of being in crowded places where it's very difficult to get a connection, let alone stream what you might be wanting to send back out, to show people, hey, I'm having this great experience. And in our case, I don't want to be competing with somebody who is, yes, wanting to share a video of a great experience that they're having at the moment, whereas I need to be able to get a video to somebody who to give me the fundamental information of how many feet forward is the exit that I'm trying to get to. And I think in that case, I'm not saying my need is more important, but I'm saying that is a high priority need that needs to be delivered. If it can't be delivered, then I can't really deliver a service to somebody that's effective in terms of getting access to that visual information.
Excellent point. So thank you to the panel, Chip, Mary, and Paul, and they will come back up at the end. So thank you so much. Our next panel is Key Performance Indicators for Accessibility. We have Dr. Christian Vogler, who is a professor in the Communication Studies program. He's also the Department of Communication Studies for Gallaudet University. He's the director of the Technology Access Program Research Group. He leads and co-leads multiple research grants that focus on accessible technology for the deaf and hard of hearing. The topics he focuses on are video relay services, caption telephone services, closed caption for TV and streaming video, better consumer control over hearing aids and cochlear implants, next generation smart home alerting systems, and accessibility voice interfaces like Amazon, Alexa, and Google Assistants. Welcome, Dr. Vogler. The respondents are Susie Rosen Singleton. She's the Chief Disability Rights Officer, Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau for the FCC. She's a native user of American Sign Language, the Chief of the Disability Rights Office of Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau of the FCC. She's a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and holds a Juris Doctor from the UCLA School of Law and a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. We're also joined by Claudia Gordon. She's the Director of Government and Compliance at Sprint. She's the first female American African deaf lawyer in the United States. She's also the first deaf student to graduate in 2000 from the American University Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. At AU, Gordon specialized in disability rights, law, and policy. Since earning her Juris Doctorate from AU, she has been active in working to ensure the rights of people with disabilities, that they are respected, and she was born in rural Jamaica. So welcome to the panel. So Dr. Vogler, I know you're going to do a presentation. It's still not working. Maybe the...
Mic check, 1, 2.
Yeah, we could. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. I do have video slides that I will bring up here.
Right. Oh, here we go.
Okay, so I'm going to stand. And the reason for that is so that I can go ahead and sign and everyone can see me while I'm communicating. It's very important that everybody should be able to see me. And so what I'd like to discuss is key performance indicators in accessibility and fundamentally about things that you can measure to determine whether you are meeting accessibility goals. So I'm going to abbreviate key performance indicators with KPI. Okay, so exactly how you measure accessibility. Is it good enough? That's the question. So, KPI, or key performance indicators, are created to create a solution. We try and narrow it down to 2 KPIs for captions in 2 contexts: video programming and captioned telephone services, and specifically about how to determine if captions are usable. You need to be able to do that without sitting with every user and asking them. So hopefully you're able to see that, the 2 pictures that I've indicated on my slides. This is also where it gets controversial with human captioners. So actually, if you see both of those 2 KPI indicators, you can see them well on the slides, and they can hopefully communicate the information of what a challenge it is to try and capture with accuracy that is sufficient. And I really do want to emphasize accessibility and the importance of that and usability. Now, how do we measure that? It's not easy. Can you actually count how many words accurately that are going to be communicated? There are many different ways to do that. So I think, that concept, we just need to throw that out. That's worthless. It's not helpful. And the company who provides captions, there are many companies who provide captions, and really, honestly, they say that they can do that with 98% accuracy, but those methods of measuring have not become standardized. So some captions are better, some captioners are better than others. And how can we predict that that would be done with 98% accuracy? We can't do that. So I really do want to emphasize that if we measure and begin to focus our attention on the users, we'll be able to do that with better accuracy. Not 100%, but better. Okay, so now you will see on the next slide just what a challenge it is to be able to meet the needs of all the users. Because they're not all the same. Some users use sign language. Some users are hard of hearing. Some users take in information quickly. Others need a slower pace. So, for example, in terms of reaching 99% accuracy, when all that information is coming up so quickly and streaming so fast, that would be impossible for a slow user. So that accuracy is inaccurate. So if we want to present captions with accuracy to a slow reader, there will be quite a lot of lag time, and the information for the faster reader would not come through with the accuracy they need. So if captioning is done in a beautifully palatable way, and then the utterances that the speaker uses are including and then that may distract from the information as well. So the goal is to be able to communicate the information without lag time, but we want to make sure not to have any errors, and to be sure that each user is able to receive the information in a way that is palatable for them and matches their preferences. So honestly, it's very difficult to have a standard in terms of how to best caption. So if we focus on the KPI, which is the key performance indicators in accessibility, it's very important that we're able to match the user's needs as well. Can we predict the dependability in terms of how that information is communicated for each user? That's very tough. All of us will agree on that topic. So I really do want to encourage a complete and thorough investigation as to how to best measure the KPI.
Susie?
Hi, good morning, everyone. And before I get started with my response to Dr. Vogler, I want to take a quick poll of the room here of your use of captioning, not just captioning, but also video description, because that is about access to information as well. So if I could ask by a show of hands, who uses either captioning or video description of those of you in the room? Show of hands. Okay, great. I see almost everyone in the room is making use of one or the other. And that is because we recognize that this type of feature is not only limited to people with disabilities, it really is a feature that's used by everyone. There's a study in the UK that said 90% of people who are using captioning are not deaf or hard of hearing, which really makes us consider how well captioning is being integrated, and that information experience has to be truly accurate. Keep in mind as well, some of us, I think, watched Neil Romano's keynote speech yesterday, in which he said, of course, of all men, meaning all humans, are created equally, and at least that was aspirational, wasn't true at the time. But then we see the same kind of theory now with captioning, and I'll just say not all errors are created equal. And the reason being, if you think about emergency communications context, and you're saying, let's say the phrase is when you call 911, you're attempting to say, "I'm not breathing." Well, and the word "not" doesn't make it in. That's a world of difference. This person is not allergic to X. That "not" is very important in that sentence. Some words are far more important than others. So in order to understand what accuracy really means, as Dr. Vogler said, we're talking about 98% accuracy. That's not always a meaningful statistic if you're not counting the words in a significant way. And there's a number of different factors that have to be considered, and they may not always be perfectly compatible. Looking at the FCC's captioning rules for video programming, we do have captioning quality rules for video programming. And in 2014, when we were developing those rules, we did not have a sufficient record to be able to incorporate specific metrics. We had some consumer groups who were advocating for measurable outcomes, KPI, and science-based outcomes, but we weren't able to incorporate that because, as I said, there was insufficient record for that. So we went ahead with some qualitative requirements, and there are 4 aspects to our qualitative requirements. The first is accuracy, and that is to the extent possible. Content is supposed to be captioned verbatim, whether it be song lyrics, or what have you, everything should be captioned. Second, proper placement on the screen so the captions are not covering up other important visual information like faces or important graphics. Third, synchronicity. The captions should be synchronized with the audio track. And of course, there's some delay that's understandable, but it can't be an unreasonable amount of delay. Fourth, completeness. Ensuring that captions should be complete for the entire program before new content comes on the screen. I know it may sound a little elementary to you, but very oftentimes you're at the end of a cliffhanger and there's just a handful of lines. They jump to commercial, and all of a sudden you're in the commercial and don't know those last few lines because the captions weren't complete. That's where completeness really is one of those pillars and main components. Those are our 4 aspects to caption quality for video description, or excuse me, for video programming on television. In terms of metrics, as we're looking at emerging technologies like automated speech recognition and artificial intelligence that are going to give us more and more data to crunch and more information to look at moving forward. Internet Protocol Caption Telephone Service, another area where we're looking at quality of captions. We do have another verbatim requirement for that service. However, we don't have a clear understanding of what the standards are yet. We're still in the process of reviewing that right now. Automated speech recognition is here to stay, as I'm sure people are aware, so we're looking at how that's going to integrate with our various systems. And with that said, I'm looking forward to hearing Claudia's response.
Good morning, everyone. I'm deaf-friendly. I'm thinking here I'll need my notes, so I think I'll move over so I can see clearly and have my notes in front of me. All right, can everyone in the audience who needs to see me to communicate see me clearly? I am from Sprint, so I am a provider of 2 different forms of caption telephone service. The first is IPCTS, or Internet Protocol Caption Telephone, and that is the internet version of that phone. So Sprint provides caption telephone and internet caption telephone. Our charge is based on FCC regulation and Title IV of the ADA to provide functionally equivalent service. That term, functional equivalence, what does that mean exactly? My deaf peers in the audience, I'm sure, would recall TTY relay. We remember that. TTY relay was once considered functional equivalence. People typed 45 words per minute, and we thought that was super, functionally equivalent. Whereas if we compare that to today, the requirement is 60 words per minute. So I do think it's very important to note that the NAD in 2014 did write a position paper. Their position paper said, as telephone services and technology evolve, the scope and achievements of what are possible for functional equivalency must also evolve. Basically, that means functional equivalence, as defined, must continually change. It must change in order to close that gap. Services must be equivalent for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or have a speech disability to allow them to use the telephone in the same manner that someone can use a phone without any assistance. So functional equivalency is not a one-time fix, it's a continually evolving concept. As a provider, a big challenge is how we can measure things. How do you measure things that are not directly observable? For example, a user of a captioned telephone. What is their comprehension? Are they understanding the call, or is the captioning content confusing what's happening? Everything's happening real time, so how is that measurable? It is a big challenge to figure out. So we try to measure things that are actually directly observable. One example of that is error rate. So we're looking at how many errors are produced in the captions. Sprint, like I mentioned earlier, provides IP-CTS, and our partner in that endeavor is Ultratech. Ultratech did research, and they filed an ex parte in December of 2018 with the FCC. That ex parte is public information. So they were researching the impact of accuracy and delay. Delay is also known as latency. So accuracy and latency. What is the impact on users? What is their personal satisfaction, and is this service functionally equivalent? That research showed that accuracy is statistically highly connected to consumer experience. So UX is very affected by accuracy. Accuracy is about 5 times more powerful than latency in predicting consumer satisfaction in using captioned telephone services. And earlier presenters mentioned, Christian, you said KPI. How do we develop that, and how can we measure things with KPI? I agree with that that's a very difficult thing to measure. We believe it's important to have redundant approaches. When you measure in different ways, you get to different solutions and different answers. As different questions are posed, different solutions come up. So again, redundancy in how these things are measured is very important. Christian, you also mentioned the concept of good enough. We don't believe there's any point in time that captions will be good enough for every single person. There will never be good enough. That is because every user experiences captioning in a different manner. So inaccurate captions may not be good enough for one user, and an increase in accuracy, we believe, will increase functional equivalency and customer satisfaction. Even 1% increase in accuracy, 98 to 99%, makes a big difference in customer opinion and perception of this service, and if it is indeed functionally equivalent or not. There are many other professions and many other people that are involved in this work. There is testing, there is proposed testing to be done. There are methods and procedures with IPCTS, and again, trying to come up with a standard to measure functional equivalency and quality on captions. This work isn't limited only to IPCTS providers either. There is international interest in the field as well. And in closing, this is my personal opinion, not a Sprint opinion, but as a user of services, I believe we see a lot of emphasis today on automatic speech recognition, ASR, speech to text. Obviously, everyone today wants information quickly. We want it, and we want it now. I think ASR is great, and we do see a lot of promise in that. Having a service with no human involvement. Obviously, we are advocates of innovation. But I do want to make sure that I emphasize accuracy without delay. Faster is not always useful. It's not always about latency. So a quick service that is inaccurate may not be a good customer experience. I just want to make sure that we all keep sight of that goal of having accurate captions. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can have my next panel come up, that would be great. We're going to have everybody come back at the end. So the next panel is digital accessibility. Should legislation evolve? Dan Goldstein is going to present. He is a retired attorney who represented the National Federation of the Blind and numerous blind individuals from 1986 to the end of 2017. Beginning with a suit against AOL in 1999, Dan litigated cases related to access to technology that included voting, governmental websites such as the Department of Ed student loan forms and CMS forms, Title III websites, and access to educational technology, among others. Our respondents today are Andrew Kirkpatrick. He is the head of accessibility at Adobe Systems, and his team defines Adobe's overall strategy for accessibility, attends to accessibility issues with product teams across the Adobe product line, and works with customers and standard groups, including representing Adobe on the accessibility-focused committees at the FCC, the U.S. Access Board, ETSI, and the W3C. Currently, Andrew is serving as co-chair of the W3C's Accessibility Guideline Working Group and is an editor for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 standard. We also have the amazing Karen Pulse-Strauss, who is an accessibility legal consultant, is sponsored today by Trace Rehabilitation Engineering Research Center on Information Technology Access at the University of Maryland. She's one of the country's premier disability rights attorneys on access to electronic communications and video programming for nearly 4 decades. Most recently, she spent 9 years serving as the deputy chief of the FCC's Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. So welcome to the panel. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, but it's even nicer to see how many more faces with each year there are at these conferences. There was an attempt by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division to have regulations, ADA regulations, applicable to websites. It started under the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, and had a quiet and unnoticed death at the Office of Management and Budget during the last years of the Obama administration. There was no obit in the Times or the Post. This happened because the business community was very opposed. Now, with the advent of the click-buy lawsuits, the business community is saying there ought to be a law. We need something. But what's being asked for so far is not what will solve the problem. What's being asked for so far are statutes that would provide for advanced notification. Hi, your website's accessible, but we won't sue you for 90 days because of a hope that the lawsuits will can be mooted before the end of the litigation, and since there are no damages under Title III of the ADA, that means the company gets to walk away with nothing worse than having waited to fix their website until they get notice. The other thing that's being proposed is that we get WCAG 2.1 AA enshrined as the standard. And that will presumably stay the standard the way things stayed with 508 for, I don't know exactly how long. I see Tim in the audience, he could tell us, but we could end up with 2.1 AA as the standard for the next 10, 15, 20 years. I don't think either one is the solution, but I think we can have a statute that helps move this problem forward. The problem with having the standard in the statute is that that's not why websites don't maintain accessibility. I mean, this room is full of accessibility consultants who know that they need to do more than go and say to the company, oh, here's the standard. You have to change the infrastructure, you have to change the culture, and if you don't do that, a dynamic website is not going to stay accessible for more than a nanosecond. So how do you frame your legislation so that it addresses the true nature of the problem? And is this the clicker?
It is.
Okay. I've never used PowerPoint before, so because I'm mostly talk to audiences of the blind. My first point is that there doesn't need to be a federal law because websites are present in every state, and there may be one or two people here who are under the impression that Congress is currently paralyzed. I don't know why you would think that, but therefore, if we get a law in one state, that should be enough to require all websites to conform. As I said, the technical standard is not the problem. So here is what I would suggest. We can say find a notification. Why is this not advancing? Let's see. We can say find to notification, but add some things that, there we go, thank you. Add some things as the following. One is to create a safe harbor for companies. Companies should like that. But what would they have to do to have the safe harbor? They would have to file a public website remediation plan that requires the things that all of you who are consultants in this audience know. A website accessibility coordinator who reports directly to the CIO or to the president, who is responsible for overseeing web accessibility and documenting quarterly that all new releases have been made accessible pre-production and that any post-production accessibility bugs have been remediated on a timely basis. A web accessibility policy that is distributed to all persons coding to the site, whether employees or contractors, and that is publicly on the website together with an accessible means to submit accessibility issues. Web accessibility training for all employees or contractors who develop programs or code for, or publish final content to the website and mobile operations, including training on the remediation plan and how to conform the web content and services to WCAG 2.1 AA. Performance reviews of the Web Accessibility Coordinator and employees for the degree and effectiveness with which they have taken accessibility into account. Regularly scheduled automated and user accessibility training, bug fix priority policies, addressing losses of function for individuals with disabilities. This plan, if filed and implemented, would solve the problem, and a corporation could feel safe that they are not going to get sued just because there was one image that didn't have a caption. The problem as it stands now is with the click-buy lawsuits, the lawsuit gets filed and settled. We don't know how because they're confidential settlements right now. And then there's a problem, and the owner of the website gets sued again and again. So the prospect of safe harbor should get business and people with disabilities on the same side of the fence. But you have to make sure that the companies don't lie. So there need to be heavy penalties for false statements. What else should go in the law, in the state law? All settlements have to be public. When I was representing the National Federation of the Blind, with one exception, all of our settlements were public, and the one exception, all of the main features of the settlement were made public. If we don't do that with the click-buy lawsuits, we don't know what, if anything, has been resolved. The state AG should have enforcement powers, and perhaps after 5 years or 10 years, a successful suit to a company that hasn't filed for safe harbor can be sued for significant damages. So it would be carrots and it would be sticks. This seems to me something that everybody should be able to agree on. If there needs to be the technical standard, it needs to be something that will automatically update, or will have an experience like we had with 508 forever. I'm not even sure that, I see Tim out there, I'm not sure he was even shaving on a daily basis when 508 was first talked about updating. The other thing, which I forgot to include in my slides, but I think this law should include aider and abetter liability for authoring tools that make it difficult to be accessible. Then it will suddenly become very easy for small businesses to make their websites accessible, because we'll see a version of GoDaddy with an accessibility checker as you build your site. Every time I think of GoDaddy and some of the others, I think of a line I heard in a play when I was in college where the character said, every 6 seconds somewhere in the world a woman is giving birth to a child. We have to find that woman and stop her. That's what GoDaddy is doing, and the other such, and we need to get to the source of the problem, especially for small business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew?
Thank you, Dan. So I obviously can't speak for all businesses, and there's many businesses of different sizes around the country, around the world, some of which have dedicated staff who pay attention to and are aware of accessibility issues, and some of which are too small or don't have that for some other reason. So speaking for Adobe, we are not opposed to legislation. It's not something that seems like it matters whether we're opposed to or not opposed to. There is legislation, there will be legislation, and so our focus is more about making sure that that legislation is done in a way that is sustainable and that we can properly support. One of the concerns that I have around a state-focused law is highlighted by the recent ruling from the Southern District in New York in the Kroger case, where there's a lawsuit that was dismissed against Kroger, and it was dismissed based on jurisdiction, in part because it was a New York State resident who was suing in New York, and Kroger doesn't have any business operations in New York. They do have a website that you can reach from New York, but as a result, the suit was dismissed. And if there could be legislation in a state that addressed the primary concerns that we see, and primary concerns are around harmonization so that we don't have fragmented rules in different states and different countries, and also around making sure that there's an achievable set of baseline requirements that we need to pay attention to. So what happens in New York when this lawsuit's dismissed? Someone who's in Ohio, where Kroger's based, says, well, we need a law in our state. And that's fine as long as we wind up with the same rules and we wind up with the same standards so that businesses know what bar they are being held to. And the concern is that Ohio deviates just a little bit and Florida deviates just a little bit. And we already have this challenge, and companies spend a lot of resources working around the world, because with the UNCRPD, we've got 160 plus countries around the world that need to create accessibility rules. And so we're working hard to make sure that there's harmonized standards that are available, and many companies and many end users, invited experts participate to make sure that those standards are good. But then we also have to make sure that those standards are adopted in a way that works from one country to another, because what Adobe does for the United States, if it's different in Canada or in Europe or China or New Zealand, it's going to decrease the likelihood that we can effectively deliver solutions that address everyone's needs. So with regard to harmonization, because we're an international company, because there is this possibility of in individual states, end users being able to effectively advocate for a specific change, that in some ways would point to the value of having a federal legislation that addresses this. But again, I don't really care whether it's federal or whether it's state, as long as we can ensure that there is harmonization and that the baseline requirements are achievable. Related to the baseline requirements, we have done a lot of work, as was mentioned. I'm the co-chair of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and we developed WCAG 2.1. Our intention with WCAG is to produce a WCAG 2.2, to have updated standards available at roughly every 18 months to 2 years, so that when new policies are adopted, that there is always an updated standard that can be referenced, and that standard could be updated within or by the specific legislation as well. But because it's because it's created by a consortium of companies and individuals, representatives of users with disabilities that are part of the working group, and that helps ensure that we're making sure that the standard is effective and that it is measurable, and that in part is going to contribute to the safe harbor concepts that Dan's talking about in the legislation, which are incredibly important for companies to be able to identify how they, what they need to do in order to address accessibility, so that it is so that they can be confident that they are doing the right thing and that are not going to be targeted by frivolous lawsuits. And not all lawsuits are frivolous, I will say also.
Karen? Thank you. Okay, I'm back, and it's great to be back in this capacity. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be able to continue my work in a new capacity, and I thank the RARC, the Trace Center, for allowing me to represent them here today. So first I want to agree with you, Andrew. I am skeptical of state laws. We had state laws for telecommunications relay services many years ago. They weren't consistent. They created different standards and different gaps, and that's why we needed a federal relay system, a nationwide relay system. So it's my opinion that consistency and uniformity, as well as international harmonization, is extremely important. But I also want to deviate a little bit. So Dan and I come from different worlds, and my world is not as much website focused. And this particular panel, I believe the focus, it was called, this particular lightning round, digital accessibility. And I think that what we need to do is we need to broaden our approach to what we're thinking about when we talk about digital accessibility, because it's not just websites. It's also apps. It's interactive apps. It's setting calendars and accessing photos online or in the cloud, or doing games, or monitoring health metrics, controlling the lighting and the temperature in our home. There's a plethora of different applications that we have when we talk about digital accessibility. We also in the future, as you all know from the presentations so far, everything is changing. Our interfaces are changing. There's liquid hardware interfaces. There's virtual reality, augmented reality, machine learning, AI. There's even, according to Greg Vanderheiden, on the way, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this, brain interfaces that will allow people to present and perceive information at will. It's scary to me, but if it's coming, we have to be prepared for it. Why? Because we've already lived this before. It's a broken record. If we don't plan for accessibility, people with disabilities will be left behind, as they were when digital communications came along and hearing aid compatibility wasn't ready for 10 years. When digital captioning came along, or digital television came along, and the captions were messed up for many, many years. So preparing for it now is critical. So how do we do it? I'm an advocate for legislation, but I don't have to be. I mean, if it's done by itself, fine. If the industry does it by itself, that's fine. But I do see a big difference here as compared to before. I think a lot of the industries that are represented here are already self-propelled. We've gotten there. The telecom industry, the IT industry, television. You guys have it. You have it made. You know what you're doing. You know we've reached the tipping point to a large extent. I realize that there are still gaps, but for those of you that are covered by the CVAA or the ADA or Section 255, a lot of you have taken it further. And a lot of the progress that was made thus far was done collaboratively, sometimes with regulation, sometimes through advisory committees. I like to call them the ACC committees: TAC, ITAC, VPAC, EAC, DAC, it goes on and on, CAC, you know what I'm talking about. But the problem is, who are we trying to reach now? We're not necessarily trying to reach only the providers of telecom or IT or video programming services. We're reaching everyone. We're reaching the candy store that I used to walk to in Brooklyn on the corner and buy 5-cent candy. It's now online. We're reaching the dress shop that I used to walk into. It's now online. We're reaching all of these online entities that have no idea, and that's the problem. They have no idea that they're covered by anything, and they don't know how to be covered. So how do we reach them? Well, I think that that's the challenge, and I think that that's why some kind of federal guidance has to be provided. So maybe there needs to be something comparable to the ADAG, the ADA Accessibility Guidelines, in the form of the ADA Virtual Accessibility Guidelines, or which would be the ADAVAG, or maybe the ADADAG, the ADA Digital Accessibility Guidelines. And it would create, I agree on Safe Harbor, perfect approach. It's been working for real-time text. It's a great approach. It sets a bar. It also worked for internet captioning. So I agree on that. So it would cover the basic services and features that any entity would have to provide to ensure digital accessibility. So just a couple of last points. So if there is federal legislation, what does it have to be? Again, I vote for federal. Need collaboration. When we did the CVAA, the reason I think it was so successful, not only at the legislative level, but also the regulatory level, is we involved as many components of the industry as we possibly could: government, industry, consumers, technologists, researchers. The legislation needs to be functionally based and, to the extent possible, and this is really hard to do, made future-proof. We tried as much as we could in the CVAA to use terms like successor technologies. We did it in the Television Decoder Act, too, for future types of television apparatuses, saying as we go forward, those new successor technologies have to be accessible as well. It needs to be goal-oriented, not specific to certain technologies, so it can grow with new technologies, and that was mentioned yesterday in one of the panels as well. And I think that if we look at that, then that'll be very useful. It also needs to address some populations that have not been sufficiently addressed in the past, including cognitive and intellectual disabilities. And I am done. The rope is coming to take me off. So thank you.
Don't maybe get the
no,
hook
I'm done.
out, so.
I'm done. I was finished. So.
And we're gonna have some time later. So thank you so much to the panel. And I promise I'll let you come back and address this, Dan. So the next panel is Smart Cities for All, and the panel is coming up now. So Karen Tamley serves as the Commissioner for the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities under the Mayor of Chicago, Lori E. Lightfoot. They promote the full inclusion of people with all types of disabilities and strive to make Chicago the most accessible city. Let me help with this. Move this out of the way. Give you this. Is that good? All right, cool. In 2016, Commissioner Tamley was appointed by President Obama to serve on the U.S. Access Board, which develops national accessibility guidelines and standards. Commissioner Tamley earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley. Our respondents today are Malcom Glenn. He's the head of global policy for accessibility. He works with Uber. I left that out, but he's the head of global policy for accessibility in underserved communities at Uber Technology in Washington, D.C., where he leads Uber's global efforts to make the current and future platform more accessible for historically marginalized groups. Prior to joining Uber, Malcom was an executive communications manager at Google. He's a board member for Build Metro DC and the World Institute on Disability, and I also am on that wonderful board. Malcom received a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard College, where he's the president of the Harvard Crimson. Megan Lawrence is a senior accessibility technical evangelist at Microsoft with 15 years of experience working with the disability community. Dr. Lawrence builds trusted relationships with customers, NGOs, and assistive technology partners to further Microsoft's mission of empowering every person and organization to achieve more through the lens of inclusion. Megan works deeply with customers and the disability community to educate, keep them up to date on the latest at Microsoft Accessibility, and including how we continue to build a culture of inclusion and how built-in accessibility is a lens of innovation in Microsoft technology. So, Karen, you have the floor. It is off. It should just be working.
Okay. Hello?
Is it good?
Okay, great. I want to talk just a bit about some of the work we're doing in local government, the city of Chicago, third largest city in the nation, where my role is to make Chicago the most accessible it can be for people with all types of disabilities. We provide a variety of independent living services. We do policy and legislative work, as well as initiatives to make Chicago fully inclusive, really in all areas. Transportation, emergency preparedness, employment, contracting, recreation, city events, you name it. And so it is certainly a really major challenge. And, you know, like most cities, we're rapidly becoming more and more users of technology. I'm finding my role definitely be a lot more focused not just working on the physical accessibility for folks with disabilities or programmatic accessibility, but also looking in the area of technology and how do we make sure that we are deploying technologies that are usable for folks with disabilities. So we're moving towards that area of being really a smart city, meaning our city is using technology to be more efficient, to save money, to do things that we would normally have to have humans do, but we can do through technology, but also to make our city more livable for all of our residents and more efficient. So definitely that focus is something that we are shifting towards. We started our digital action agenda actually about 12 years ago when Excel LeBois came to Chicago, and he and I hosted a roundtable with the disability community, folks with different types of disabilities about their experience accessing technology to city services. And I did that with our CIO, and I have to say it was extremely transformational because it was really the fire that we needed to start thinking about how we include people with disabilities, how we deploy city technology that does or does not include individuals with disabilities. And from there, what we did is really developed a city digital action agenda that was both visionary and operational, and it was really an opportunity for us to take a hard look at things like, our websites, what kind of standards we are using, our procurement processes, but also doing this in partnership with the disability community. So one of the things that came out of this was a technology advisory committee that I established using folks with different types of disabilities to really give us on-the-ground input on what we're putting out there. And so now, fast forward 12 years, what we're really talking about is smart cities. And again, I have the pleasure to work with G3 ICT because Chicago was selected last fall, supported by Microsoft, to be the first city in the world to pilot the Smart City for All Digital Inclusion Maturity model. And that's really a benchmarking system, honestly, for us to assess how we're doing on technology and inclusion for people with disabilities. And it really looks at 5 main areas. So strategy, what's our vision, how do we make our case for digital inclusion at the city, looking at culture, so how do we engage people with disabilities, our process, like our procurement processes, how we use our budgets to further this, as well as standards and solutions. And then lastly, data. So how are we using data, addressing the data desert, as it's called, around key data that impacts people with disabilities. So how are we gathering that? How are we making that public on our city's open data portal? So those are the 5 areas that we're starting to look at, and this is really our next generation roadmap for how Chicago is going to move forward towards digital inclusion. So I wanted to highlight just 3 things that I think have made us successful and 4 major challenges that I see. So first, I think the things that make us successful is the fact that I am appointed by the mayor, so I'm in the mayor's cabinet, so the disability office in Chicago is very elevated. So all the city department heads are my peers. You don't find that in many cities. The disability offices tend to be buried in other layers of bureaucracy. So I think having that ability allows me to effectuate change. But also it's the strong relationship that I have with our CIO. We've both been long-term employees of the city. We've worked together over 10 years, and I think having that longevity and that consistency really makes this effective. There's a lot of turnover, and I always see that turnover kills projects because you have to start over, you get someone new, and their priority isn't the same as the person you were working with previously. The second thing is just having that vision and leadership, so having a culture of where you want to go, what is your vision, and having that come from the highest level, the mayor in particular. And then the third is really having a strong working relationship with the disability community. Working in government, I get a ton of complaints all the time from the disability community about what's wrong, what they see as a problem. Most people might not like complaints, but I love complaints because it gives me an opportunity to really see what's going out on the world. And every day I get like a text or something on social media, a picture of something that's going wrong or things that we need to fix. And it's extremely helpful for me because I'm just not the only one in our government saying it. I can honestly speak on behalf of the community itself. So the challenges, that I see are, first, in deploying a smart city is really the resources, both the fiscal resources but also the human resources. The fiscal resources, being able to deploy new and innovative technologies, and we just haven't had the investments at the city level that we'd all like to see. It's just not all there, and you're constantly dealing with do more with less, budget cuts and budget constraints, and so that's certainly a challenge. From the human side, it's the expertise. So how do we bring on people that actually have expertise in digital accessibility and put them in the right places to really make it work. The second is just competing demands at the city and getting this on the attention, the radar screen. When you're a city, you're dealing with so many major issues, but how do you elevate this to really make it work? The third is the business case, and I feel like at times we're very reactive, so constantly reacting to a lawsuit, or being embarrassed by a lawsuit, or the financial resources that will have to be put out to remedy this. And so I would like the conversation changed to be more of an equity issue, a human and civil rights issue, and not just a reactive lawsuit. We're reacting to this issue. And thankfully, we do have a new mayor who is very deeply focused on the issue of equity, so I'm looking forward to having that on her agenda. And then lastly is the digital divide, and I think that's an issue that we can't ignore. The fact is that, poverty and disability are very closely linked, and I think Chicago, like other cities in the U.S. and around the world, really face, I think, three major issues with the digital divide. One is connectivity. In some of our most impoverished neighborhoods, there was a study that came out by our local public radio station very recently that said 56% of the residents in these certain neighborhoods don't even have an internet subscription. And so, given that disability and poverty are very linked, I know that includes a lot of people with disabilities. The second thing is really the access to devices and being able to have a device to do business. And then the third is just the digital literacy skills to be able to make that happen. So most city services now are online. Transportation services, reduced fare applications for transit. Even public housing is an online application. And so really what I'm seeing is how, if we're not paying attention to these issues as well, we are further exacerbating poverty, isolation of people with disabilities, and we cannot ignore that. I talked to my staff this week, and they reported to me with confidence that of the about 225 people that walk into our office every month for services, for some of these basic services, 85% are coming to us because they do not have access to the digital space. They don't have a smartphone. They don't have the level of comfort that's needed to be able to fill out an application for basic public services. So I think these are challenges, and I think if we're going to really focus on the issue of smart cities, we have to look both at what we're deploying and is that accessible, but also whether people with disabilities are really going to be able to actively utilize those deployments. And then just one last thing that's really on my mind is as we move to a cashless society and are paying for everything via technology, how are our communities who are low-income, impoverished, people with disabilities going to really, truly be able to be part of the fabric of our cities? Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
Megan, go ahead.
Oh, am I going to go? Is my mic going to come on? There we go. Absolutely brilliant, Karen. I really want to thank the city of Chicago and all of the leadership there for being the first, because being the first means being brave, right? And it was not only an opportunity for you guys to really help influence the maturity model, but you certainly opened the doors to us as well. And so that was incredible. But the more incredible part was that we were there on the coldest day in like 10 years. It was literally the polar vortex. It was, negative 40 with wind chill, 45, something like that. And the city of Chicago model is the city that works, and they live up to that motto. Every single city official that was part of this maturity model showed up on time, showed up with smiles on their faces. So I just absolutely bonding experience for all of us that were there. You can imagine that the kind of dedication that it takes not only to continue to keep a city working during those kinds of conditions, but it showed in the way that we began to uncover the relationships and the dedication that we saw to accessibility accessibility in the city. And I think you're right. One of the things that really stood out to us was the relationship that your office has with the CIO. And that strong relationship led to the ability to implement real policies and real change within the city. But part of what the maturity model does is not only uncover those moments of brilliance, which certainly the city of Chicago has plenty, but also those areas of opportunity to grow. And over the last few years working with G through ICT, that's something that I've seen echoed. I've talked to over 70 cities globally now, and accessibility and digital inclusion, they believe, is key to their city's success and certainly their long-term sustainability. But oftentimes when we ask how accessible is your city, people are unsure. And so this tool allows city officials, as well as all of those fantastic vendors and contractors and organizations like many of you represent, to come into that conversation and begin to talk about where are those paths to make data-driven investment strategies, right? So finding those places that we know will lead to better solutions. And I think you're absolutely correct. Sometimes that means uncovering what are the access needs. Do we have broadband? Do we have the kinds of resources that we need to teach people how to use technology? But hopefully it is also helping us identify that as we all run towards this thing called SMART, that we're doing it in an accessible way. Some of the research that G3ICT unearthed, probably about 2 years ago, was that the smart cities environment is making the digital divide worse if we don't think carefully about the types of technology that we implement and using those vendors to help us implement them in an accessible way. Because cities are where people with disabilities live, work, and play. This is where we all live, work, and play. And so while technology has the great opportunity to bring us together, we also have to be thoughtful about making sure that we can all move freely in our environments so that we have those opportunities to get an education, get that dream job, or have coffee with our friends. There's one particular company that I think is incredibly interesting and relevant when we talk about data-driven investment strategies, and that's called Cyclomedia. So in the city of New York, there had been some complaints, your favorite thing, complaints, about curb cuts, literally the physical infrastructure. And so this company went out and used LiDAR data and high-resolution imagery to map the entire city and begin to help the city identify how to make those long-term investment strategies over time. And then that can lead back into a maturity model. So I just want to make the point, again, that was a moment of data. I'm sure you will hear at this conference several times the opportunity, or really the need, for better data about and with the disability community. And how are we using that in a way to inform what we all do? Because the lifeblood of any smart city is data. The lifeblood of artificial intelligence is data. And so I really encourage all of us to proactively think about not only how we collect data, how we share our data, but what that means for long-term improvements in cities and technology over time.
Thank you, Megan. Malcolm?
Well, thank you.
I think it's okay.
Well, thank you, Debra, and thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to have this conversation. I always love being a part of conversations about things like smart cities, because I think that's actually a term that means a great deal of different things to different people, depending on what you're talking about and what your perspective is. But I think it's clear, and I think Karen and Megan have made the point so eloquently, that if we don't have these conversations early about whatever we're talking about that makes equity and accessibility a core component of the conversation in the early stages, we know that history has lots of examples of ways in which new technologies and new innovations have left folks behind, people with disabilities, black and brown folks, folks from low-income backgrounds, seniors, a whole host of folks. And so I think it's really important that we're engaged in this conversation at these early stages, even when we don't have a consensus around exactly what smart cities means. But from the perspective of Uber, I think in a lot of ways, smart cities, and when you're thinking about future technologies, it has a lot to do with the investment in the work we're doing around autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. And of course, I think this is a really interesting group that in a lot of ways doesn't need to be bought in around the value proposition for self-driving cars in ways that it can improve things like safety. The 1.3 million people who die in car crashes every year, more than 1 million of those folks are dying in those crashes as a result of human error. From a mobility perspective, an accessibility perspective, from what it can do to improve the environment, the built space, the billions of dollars we can save in not investing in parking and giving back that space to the people to do with it what they'd like to do, from a congestion standpoint. But all of these things, we're not going to get there, and they're sort of underpinned by these barriers that we have to tackle first. And I think there are three main ones that I think about when it comes to the way we're thinking about the future. It's the technological barriers, it's the regulatory barriers, and then it's the psychological barriers. And I'll sort of go from the last one to the first one. I think the psychological barrier is one that I think has been underestimated in a lot of the conversations around autonomous vehicles and what they're going to look like in the cities of the future. Many, many polls point to the very real fears that people have when it comes to the notion of getting into a car that doesn't have a person. Now, that's not the case for everyone, particularly people who don't have the ability to drive today or for whom mobility is in some way not as robust as it is for other people. That's a real value proposition, but I think getting the general public excited and comfortable with this is a really important barrier that we have to overcome. The regulatory one is really, really important as well. There are still regulations in place in some states that say that you have to have a driver's license to be the only person in a motor-operated vehicle. Well, that obviously doesn't make sense in a future where autonomous vehicles are a large part of the fleet that's on the road. And so we have to educate lawmakers about what we have to do to make sure that there is access to this technology and there is an ability for companies to test this technology in a robust way so that we can get it into the hands of consumers sooner rather than later. And then, of course, there's the technological barrier. And, what you'll often hear folks say is, it wasn't that hard to get 90% of the way there, but the last 10% actually takes 90% of the work. And I would say we are at somewhere around there in terms of the technological advancement in this space. We're maybe, depending on how you look at it, 90% of the way there, but that last 10% is going to be the real barrier and the real challenge. And so I think there are tons of opportunities when it comes to what this technology could look like. When you think about the integration into the physical space, things like vehicle to infrastructure technology, vehicle-to-vehicle infrastructure technology. These are things that lots of folks are talking about. It's actually not something that we're focused on. We're focused on building the technology so that it can work sort of in a vacuum on its own. But I think there's lots of opportunities to think about what we could do from an infrastructure standpoint, how we could better engage with cities in order to make this technology work in a more networked framework. That requires a ton of infrastructure investment, and Paul mentioned earlier the infrastructure investment that's required in order to deploy 5G in a robust way. I think the same could be said about a whole host of technologies. So I think it's important that we start to have those conversations with cities sooner rather than later about what we need and what other entities in this space need in order to make that infrastructure work. The last thing I'll say is all of this is I think, a great conversation, and it's important for us to be engaged in it, but ultimately all of this needs to be underpinned by a core focus on accessibility today. We can't build a network of the future if the network on which we are building it is inaccessible today. And so that's why it requires so much focus from companies like mine on making sure that if we're going to have an AV fleet that's accessible 10 years from now, that means we need to invest in making a ride-sharing fleet with human drivers as accessible as possible today. And so I love these conversations, but I will be very candid with you. I spend the overwhelming majority of my time disabusing people of having these conversations too often, because I think we need to make sure that the thing on which we are building it is as accessible as possible, because, again, the notion of trying to make accessibility an afterthought in the autonomous conversation is going to be that much more difficult if we continue to think about accessibility and afterthought in today's conversation. And so it's important to hold companies like mine accountable in terms of what we're doing today, but I think it's also really important to hold companies like the ones that are building the cars of the future accountable in terms of those conversations, because what we've seen in ride sharing today is one of the biggest barriers to accessibility, particularly for people who use wheelchairs, is the vehicles aren't there in the robust way that we would need them to be. And if we can change that when it comes to the accessible future, it's going to have an amazing impact on the way that people are able to engage with this technology, notwithstanding all of the digital investments we make, notwithstanding all of the policy investments that we make.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask this panel to stay up here, and if members of the other panels will come back, I'm going to remind everybody what we just talked about, because we talked about a lot of great information with some amazing leaders. And so the first panel was 5G network performance and user experience. The next one was key performance indicators for accessibility. The third one was digital accessibility should legislations evolve. And the fourth one was smart cities for all. So as my panelists are coming back in, what we're going to do is we'll take questions, but please don't make us use the hook on you. So you've got 10 seconds to tell us who you are and give us the question. And please make sure that you address your question to one of the panelists. So, and if you don't remember their names, you can just tell us what the theme is about. And while everybody's coming up, I'm going to do a quick shout out for Frances West, who is signing her new book, Authentic Inclusion. And I'm also going to do a quick commercial for IAAP. Remember, IAAP belongs to us. We are the accessibility professionals. So if you're not part of it, if your company's not sponsoring it, if you're not supporting them, attending their webinars, they did some amazing awards yesterday. So please remember that we're going to grow as a global accessibility community if we support organizations like IAAP. So I thought I'd throw a commercial in for them as well. So do I have a taker that would like to ask a question? Okay, and hopefully we have, somebody's going to bring you a mic. So we have 2 hands up. So, okay, so if somebody could grab a mic, get a mic to somebody, that would be great, because I want to be really conscious of the time.
Hello. A question from Karen and Megan. How did you design the accessibility maturity models that you're referencing?
So this is Megan Lawrence, in collaboration with G3 ICT. So they really took the lead on thinking about how to build the digital inclusion smart city maturity model. So I highly encourage you to talk with James Thurston for more details on that one. And then, of course, we worked with both the City of Chicago and the City of Raleigh to make sure that the 5 pillars that Karen mentioned were the right pillars, and that we were asking the right questions to help them get to the bottom of where they felt like they stood within each one of those 5 pillars.
Okay, the next question we have, if you could, I just say give it to and then the lady with the cool looking pants will be next.
Okay, this question is for Chip. We talked about, or you all talked about 5G and all of the advantages it has, but the oncology community is very concerned about the health effects, especially on increased incidence of brain tumors. So can you address if you're looking at any health issues or those kind of things?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not an expert on the health issues related to radio frequency distribution. I know that from generally speaking, the wireless industry has done a lot of research into this, but I haven't come across anything that's been definitively proven about the potential harmful effects of radio frequency, whether it's at a high frequency, whether the spectrum is delivered high frequency or low frequency at all. So probably not the best person to ask. Sorry.
This is really a question for all of you, but I'm going to focus it on the key performance indicators. And one of my concerns is about security. Accessibility assistants like Siri and Alexa and Google are great, but they do compromise the user's security, and I am concerned that this is going to have a disproportionate effect on people who rely on these for basic accessibility. So just curious what you have to say about that.
Who would like to take that? Okay, Susie? Here.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that. Christian unfortunately had to step out for a moment. Sorry about that. But basically, privacy and security is extremely important, not only for people with disabilities, but for all of us. So with that in mind, all safeguards should be in place to ensure that we are protecting privacy and security of everyone's information if you're using accessibility features and technology.
Claudia speaking. I can speak for caption telephone. That is regulated by the FCC. So there are regulations that are enforced, and there is strong privacy and security safeguards. Call content beyond the duration of the call cannot be kept. The communications assistants that are working for companies like Sprint also have to go through a very thorough training process, and part of that training includes confidentiality and security. Those operators do need to sign a confidentiality form saying that they will keep call content confidential. And I'm sure, Paul, if you would like to speak about the operators that work for services such as IRA and their obligation to keep information confidential as well.
And I'm sorry, I misunderstood what time this was over. And we were over at 10:30, so I guess I won't be invited back next year. But so we are way over time. I apologize. And I know that there were some panelists that, you wanted to comment on states, Paul. So I'm going to ask us, we're going to end now, but maybe our panelists can go over to the side and answer any questions. So thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists.